Hello, Forensic Psych class. This is Dr. V, and we're going to pick up where we left off, but first a couple of announcements. So you already know this, hopefully, if you're watching this video, right? There's no class Wednesday because there's this video lecture. I will be covering chapter 9 in this video, starting from the example of trial consultants where we left off last time. In a separate video, it will be half of chapter 12 roughly. We'll start chapter 12 for this video lecture and stop around jury deliberations, which is page 287 for those of you keeping count in the books. Okay, keep in mind, Wednesday, a week from this current Wednesday, depending on when you're watching this video, we have exam 2 covering chapters 6 through 9 and 12. So I hope you've been studying. And finally, I have received people's paper topic and announcements. Assignments, excuse me. I'm working on grading them. Hopefully by 11/13, I'll have all of them graded and feedback given to you all so you can work on your final papers. Having said that, if you still need to turn yours in, you can turn it in up to 20 days late because I deduct 5 percentage points for each day it's late. So just upload it if you still haven't. Okay, so we covered this slide last time. This was a nice example of how trial consultants might actually operate in a real trial. Now, keep in mind, this is anecdotal, right? This is just one case. We don't have a comparison group. We don't know if what the trial consultant said was actually effective, okay? But this still gives us a really nice picture of what they do. You know, they polled residents, they got a feel for the atmosphere at this particular time, and potentially helped one side of the case. So that's the question then. As always, we have to ask, we have to evaluate whether or not something works or not from a scientific standpoint. It's not enough that you feel like it can work. We've got to evaluate it, right, in an empirical way. So does it work? Well, that kind of depends. It depends on a lot of different things, right? This kind of scientific jury selection based off of what trial consultants do with their shadow juries, with their focus groups, that can depend on the number of peremptory challenges that are given, right? So if there are a lot or a little, well, that can affect their ability to strike certain jurors. That can depend on the questions that they ask at trial, right? So consultants can ask certain questions and so can attorneys. And let me clarify, consultants can advise them to ask certain questions, but if they're not using good data, then they're not asking the right questions, right? So, and attorneys sometimes don't follow the guidance of consultants. I have a friend who actually works in consulting, and she can be rather frustrated sometimes when it seems like the attorneys or the witnesses don't want to follow consultant instructions. And if that has some kind of, if their instructions have some kind of positive impact on their defense or for the plaintiffs or whomever, then it might be good to follow their lead. But this doesn't always happen, right? Just because they're hired doesn't necessarily mean we have to follow their rules. And related to this idea of questions, if demographic details of the jurors, okay, their own demographics, their sex, their race, etc., if they actually predict verdict, this is key, right? So then if you strike or keep victims based off of their demographics, well, you're doing that hopefully under the assumption that their actual demographics actually predict verdict, okay? I'll say this probably a million times throughout our jury trial section in chapter 12, but the strength of the evidence is usually the best predictor of verdict. And typically that's when you have a strong case. If the case is strong, then you're going to get guilty verdicts. Okay, so that's usually the number one predictor. I know it seems common sense, but it's a good sign. If people are operating off of the strength of the evidence, then that's good. Problems occur when the case is ambiguous or highly circumstantial, and we'll talk about that in chapter 12. Okay. And one other thing to keep in mind with these trial consultants is that attorneys who hire consultants might also be different on several factors that might improve their chances of winning their case. Okay, so it might not be the consultants themselves, it's just that attorneys have certain qualities whom also hire consultants, and this might lead to them winning more cases, right? So they might be more conscientious in preparing for the case because they've hired a consultant and things like that. They're more thorough in their questioning, they're effective presenters, they can create a good story for the jury. We'll talk about that, okay? So, could be really an artifact of the attorneys actually just being good attorneys who tend to hire trial consultants, and consultants might not be doing much of anything, right? But scientific selection might work in a subset of cases, as you'll see, at least in chapter 12, what types of things influence jurors and juries. This particularly happens in weak and ambiguous cases, like I said before, right? So when the strength of the evidence is weak, then we tend to rely on extra legal information. Again, we'll chat about this in chapter 12, but jurors might then rely on certain things in ambiguous cases. So maybe sometimes some of the scientific selection might work. So let's look at some of these juror characteristics and see what actually predicts verdicts. So what kinds of attitudes, what's strong, what's weak, right? So things can predict, but they can predict weakly. So Penrod in 1990 examined 21 different predictors: demographic information, personality traits, how jurors use their own media, the hobbies, their attitudes, all sorts of stuff. And when he put that all together in something called a multiple regression, okay, this only explained a small percentage of variance in verdicts. In other words, trying to predict guilt or innocence is difficult, even when you account for all of these predictors. If you say, I know that this person, based off of their sex, some personality trait, their hobbies and attitudes for things, all of these only weakly predict verdict. So in other words, they're not good. Picking people based off of these characteristics isn't good at getting you a verdict that you want, okay? And a lot of these types of juror characteristics, like their demographics, can depend on case facts too. They interact. So for instance, females tend to be, but inconsistently, are more punitive towards defendants in child sexual assault cases, domestic violence, and sexual harassment cases. So some people might believe that, females might be more lenient, or excuse me, more punitive, right? Harsher towards these types of people who perpetrate sex crimes, because they tend to be victims of these types of crimes, right? Or the victim tends to be female. Okay. But again, this is really inconsistent. Picking females alone based off of, their sex, their biological sex, isn't going to guarantee you that they're going to, sympathize with the victim of the sexual assault, of the domestic violence. Okay. But you do see this one is one of the more reliable effects when you look at juror characteristics predicting verdict. Men tend to be perceived as being more influential by their jurors, and men also tend to talk more in deliberations. Whether or not that has a big impact, that's to be seen. That's tough to be answered with the type of research we have on juries, because that would impact jury deliberations, right? One verdict versus juror decisions, which are multiple verdicts. So, couple of other things that people have looked at. Basic demographic information, not so good. But if you look at some personality characteristics, those tend to be better predictors and more consistent predictors of verdict, okay? So an example of personality characteristics is this idea of locus of control, okay? And so locus of control is basically this idea that people, it talks about how people tend to explain why things happen to them. Okay, and so people can have a tendency to have an internal locus of control explanation for why things happen to them, or external. Okay, so internal people who have an internal locus of control, tend to think that outcomes are due to their own abilities and their own efforts. So the reason they got some promotions because they worked hard, right? Versus external. Okay. External locus of control is when outcomes are due to, forces outside their control. So things happen due to luck or because other people have more power over the situation. It's not their fault, right? It's not under their control, right? So one item on a questionnaire might ask something like, my mistakes and problems are my responsibility to deal with, right? And this demonstrates internal locus of control, right? So think about this for a minute. Which type do you think, internal versus external, would a prosecutor prefer in a juror? Okay. Which ones do you think a defense attorney would prefer? So take a moment to think about this. Generally speaking, to give you your answer, and pause the video if you don't have an answer yet, internal individuals, people who have an internal locus of control, are more likely to convict the defendant, okay? More likely, because the actions of the defendant, them murdering somebody, them assaulting somebody, that's all under their control, right? My mistakes, my problems are my responsibilities to deal with. So presumably, they would be harsher on the defendant because they believe that they had control over the situation. Whereas defense attorneys would probably prefer external locus of control people. They're probably less likely, or they are less likely to convict the defendant because, maybe it was an aggravated assault and these jurors might be more likely to say that, oh, the defendant couldn't control his rage or his anger. Okay. Another characteristic or attitude, personality, I should say, excuse me, that's a more moderate predictor of juror decisions is people's beliefs about belief in a just world. Okay, so this is a concept where people who are high in this belief tend to believe that the world is orderly, it's predictable, and it's just. So people, quote, get what they deserve and deserve what they get. That's generally the idea. So an item on this kind of questionnaire might be like, I feel that I get what I am entitled to have, right? So we get what we deserve. If we believe we're good people, we get good stuff. If it's a bad person, then the bad person gets bad stuff, right? That's how you can kind of think about that. So again, pause the video for a bit and think about what type of juror, high in belief in a just world or low, would a prosecutor prefer or would a defense attorney prefer? Right, so answer. Prosecutors would prefer people high in a belief in a just world or who have that belief in a just world, right? Because anything coming to the defendant like this charge is probably deserved, it's just. So you wouldn't be charged with a crime if you didn't deserve it, right? Versus a defense attorney probably wants somebody who does not have this belief in a just world. Okay, so this is another good thing to look at. And one final personality characteristic that we'll talk about is authoritarianism. Okay. And so authoritarianism, people who are high in this belief, who have high authoritarianism, adhere to really rigid traditional values, okay? They tend to really kind of believe in the traditional ways of thinking and these rules, and they also believe in submitting to authorities, okay? So an item on a scale of authoritarianism might be something like, it's always better to trust the judgment of the proper authorities in government and religion than to listen to the noisy rabble-rousers in all society who are trying to create doubt in people's minds. Okay, so like before, I want to ask you all to pause for a second and think about this. Which type do you think a prosecutor would prefer in their juror? What level of authoritarianism, high or low? What about defense attorney? So to give you your answer, usually authoritarians are more conviction prone. They tend to want to convict people more. Again, because maybe they perceive them as violating the rules and things of that nature. Okay, so authoritarians tend to be related to higher conviction rates. So prosecutors want higher authority, they want authoritarians versus defense attorneys probably don't want that. Okay. However, there is an interesting effect with authoritarianism. If the defendant is an authority figure, like a police officer, then they're less punitive. Okay, so they're lenient on the police officer defendant because they see that as a symbol of authority and they probably don't want to go against an authority. And that's the kind of flip side of this authoritarianism. Okay, so other kinds of interesting things. If you measure people's internal locus of control, their belief in a just world, and authoritarianism, they tend to be correlated with one another. In other words, and positively so, I should say. So people who are high in locus of control tend to be also high in belief in a just world and also be high in authoritarianism. Okay, they also tend to be high in conservatism and report things like fewer personal discrimination acts against themselves. There's all sorts of interesting correlations with these types of attitudes or personality characteristics, I should say. Okay. So those are really general measures of people's personality characteristics. And so some people have argued that, well, they can only tap beliefs so far, right? What's more important is maybe some legal beliefs that people have, beliefs that are related to the legal system, right? And so the one set of researchers created what's called the Legal Attitudes Questionnaire, and it's been revised since then. Okay, so now we're on the RLAQ, the Revised Legal Attitudes Questionnaire, and this is a measure of legal authoritarianism. Okay, so it's similar to authoritarianism, but it's a little bit different. Okay, legal authoritarianisms tend to express this more right-wing philosophy, and they tend to kind of, will always endorse acts constituted by authority. So anytime an authority says, this is what is happening, this is what's going on, they kind of go along with it blindly, right? And they typically are more punitive. Okay, so an item on this questionnaire might be any person who resists arrest commits a crime, right? So anybody who goes against authority commits a crime, this kind of idea of authoritarianism, but put in a legal context, right? Another item might be something like no one should be convicted for crime on the basis of circumstantial evidence, no matter how strong such evidence is. This would be somebody, if you agreed with this item, would be somebody who's low on the Revised Legal Attitudes Questionnaire, who's low on this legal authoritarianism, right? Because they're thinking, well, circumstantial evidence is not enough. They have some kind of criteria. They're a little bit more discriminative or they discriminate a little bit more when it comes to ambiguous cases, right? And so research has found that generally legal authoritarianism will predict verdicts better. It's a better predictor, right? Versus just the traditional authoritarianism that you saw a slide ago. Another scale that has been developed and revised a bit is the juror bias scale. It was first developed by Casson and Reitzman down here, and then Myers and Lessig revised it further, or they at least helped to validate the scale a little bit more. So it looks at a couple of things. This is slightly different. It's not necessarily just looking at authoritarianism from a legal perspective, but it examines how people feel in terms of the probability of the commission of the crime. So it's kind of like the subjective likelihood that the defendant actually committed the crime. So kind of where jurors sit in terms of do they generally think this person committed the crime? Is it probable? Okay. The second thing that they look at in this particular construct is what's the person's level of reasonable doubt, right? So what's their threshold of certainty that needs to be met in order to convict this person, right? Where is that bar kind of set? And so the one problem with the juror bias scale is that when you get somebody's ratings on the probability of the commission of the crime, that tends to be tied to the case facts, right? And so this can be less reliable. It's going to flip-flop depending on the type of case, because everybody's case is different. It's all going to be some different level of strength of evidence, right? Some can be stronger, can kind of be ambiguous, but they still go to trial. And reasonable doubt tends to be, that tends to be a little bit more stable. That's just somebody's threshold for like, I need to feel this much certainty in order to convict somebody. So generally speaking, you can kind of think about, not only does the juror bias scale look at this probability of commission or reasonable doubt, it can give you a degree or sense for how biased jurors are towards the defense or to the prosecution. Okay, so depending on their score, they can be more prosecution prone or vote to convict versus acquit. An item that assesses something like probability of commission, just to give you a nice example, is agreeing or disagreeing with this item. Circumstantial evidence is too weak to use in court, right? So again, this is looking at this kind of probability of whether or not somebody committed the crime. And so reasonable doubt is these items indicate things more like a defense, things more about their reasonable doubt, where their standard is for conviction. So this item saying a defendant should be found guilty if 11 out of the 12 jurors vote guilty. Well, their bar for reasonable doubt is probably kind of low, right? They don't require a unanimous decision, all 12 jurors of voting. They care that it's just a majority, right? And so this can tell you something about how likely they are to convict. And one final survey that we'll look at, well, we've got a couple, but one final one that applies a lot to criminal trials is our pretrial juror attitude questionnaire. We call it the PJAC. And so Leslie and Myers looked at basically the JBS, right, the juror bias scale, the one we just saw, and they expanded on it. They wanted to make a scale that could look at several dimensions beyond just somebody's reasonable doubt, what the probability of the commission of the crime was, or a general sense of bias towards prosecution or defense. And so they created a scale with 6 subscales. So scales can all measure one general construct, like people's pretrial attitudes, but they can, kind of fall into separate clusters. And depending on how you develop your scale based on previous theories and evidence, you can construct scales, that have subscales, sub kind of factors within them. So for instance, in the PJAC, there is conviction proneness, okay? So again, this is a pretrial questionnaire, so it's asking people for their judgments before trial. And this is going to assess basically if people are just more conviction prone than not, or people just more harsh in general and lean towards the prosecution versus defense, or guilt versus not guilty, right? There's one of the subscales is system confidence, so how much faith they have in the justice system, right? Another item is cynicism towards the defense. Maybe some people just don't like defense attorneys or defendants in general. And again, this tells you which way they might lean. People who have a social justice orientation, who want to seek that kind of justice and make sure that people are falling in line with that. They also try to assess racial bias, and you'll see pretty clearly which items those are. And innate criminality, in other words, the degree to which somebody believes like, the defendant is just criminal in general. And some people believe that. Some people believe that if you are arrested and you're being tried, that maybe you are a bad apple, you're a criminal, and that's not going to be changed. If it's not changeable, then they're more likely to convict. Okay. So at this point, I've got a couple of exercises for you all. And I wanted to do this in class, but me showing that video last time, I ran out of time, and so I didn't get to do this with you all. So I've got a couple of things I want you to do. I have these 2 scales, okay? Answer the questions here. And remember, there's a number 29 here. It's a little bit cut off. And, compare your answers on the 2. And you can average them and you can sum them, but you can actually don't do that because I have additional rules for averaging and summing. But take a look at each of these scales and see which one is which, okay, according to you. So take a look at them, maybe try to identify which items belong to what subscale and things like that. Okay, and so I guess I'll go ahead and tell you which ones are which. This is generally the authoritarianism scale, and this one is the PJAC. Okay, so go through them, read through the items, see what you think. And of course, you can always pause this video to do so. So now, let's get back to the last bit of this presentation. Okay, so I have some, oops, let's go to the next slide. I have some PJAC items that I have pulled, and I will go ahead and show each item one by one. You'll see that some of them, you'll see the ones from the PJAC that you just took if you went and did it. And right now, what I want you to do is kind of try to see if you can identify these items based on the subscales. So try and identify the subscales that each of these items represent. So here's the first item, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. And I'll give you a moment to pause this video so that you can read through these, and then I'll come back and give you the answer. And I'm back. Okay, so I hope you paused. If you didn't, you still have a chance to pause. But the first item has to do with system confidence. When it is the suspect's word against the police officers, I believe the police. Right? So this gives us a sense for how much trust they have that the criminal justice system works, right, or not, depending on how they rate that. Rich individuals are almost never convicted of their crimes. This has to do with social justice. Again, kind of making sure that people of low SES, people who have been denigrated in the past based off of their race, they get their, I don't want to say time in court, but they might be more prone to be lenient towards those individuals. Our third item, you guessed it, racial bias. Minorities use the race issue only when they are guilty. Again, if somebody agrees with this, they're probably going to be more prosecution prone. The fourth one, many accident claims filed against insurance companies are phony. This is cynicism. Okay, you kind of having this negative attitude towards the justice system anyways, right? So in a civil case, for instance, when people file against the insurance companies, you kind of maybe are more cynical about the court system, or at least people who are trying to sue, for instance, right? So you might be more cynical towards the defense, which is not good for the defense. For serious crimes like murder, a defendant should be found guilty so long as there is a 90% chance that he committed the crime. So this is tapping into conviction proneness, and just like our scale before, right, the jurors bias scale, we're looking kind of at a similar construct there, right? Just generally looking at people's level or threshold for that. And then finally, the last one is innate criminality. So if a defendant is a member of a gang, he, she is definitely guilty of the crime. We'll talk about this in chapter 12 actually, but yeah, people who maybe have this belief that this is a gang member and maybe they're being tried for some unrelated kind of thing might just believe that the defendant is going to be prone to criminality, and they won't believe that. Right? Hi. So one final scale pertains more so to civil trials. And this scale is just basically attitudes towards civil litigation, because that's a little bit different. And it also assesses things like their attitudes towards businesses, because a lot of the times corporations and businesses are part of civil suits, and just some general social attitudes. Some examples of these items are: there are far too many frivolous lawsuits today, kind of what the JBS was getting at, or excuse me, the PJAC was getting at. And most people who sue others in court have legitimate grievances, right? So this should tell you which leaning towards the plaintiff or towards the defendant they might have. Okay. So these alternative measures, okay, these measures that are more specific to legal attitudes tend to predict verdict better than those general attitude measures. So the PJAC, the RLAQ, the JBS, they tend to be better than if you just looked at authoritarianism, belief in a just world. But those still, all of these types of personality characteristics tend to explain the variance in verdicts better than if you just pick people based off of their demographic information. So keep that in mind. And so that's the end of the video for today, or at least for chapter 9. Please watch the next one for chapter 12.